Welcome. You're watching Global Today. This is the tail end of the program. We want to cross over to Senegal, where by dissolving the party of his main opponent, Senegalese President Macky Sall knew he was taking a perilous decision at the risk of inflaming the streets. The announcement came in the late afternoon of Monday, July the 31st, through the voice of Interior Minister Antoine Félix Diome. The African Patriots of Senegal for Work, Ethics and Fraternity, that is PASTEF party, has been dissolved by decree. With this move, the authorities intend to deal a fatal blow to Ousmane Sonko, the ruling party's most serious rival in the run-up to the February 2024 presidential election. A few hours earlier then, the president of PASTEF had been detained in the Sabakoitan prison. The dissolved party had frequently called on its supporters to stage insurrectionary movements, resulting in numerous casualties and injuries, as well as acts of ransacking and looting of public and private property, explained the Minister of the Interior. This was a reference to the unrest in Senegal in March 2021 and June 2023, which left over 40 people dead following the arrest and subsequent sentencing of Sonko on June the 1st to 2 years of imprisonment in a case in which he was accused of rape. And that's what we want to focus on right now. Let's just begin with you, Habib Hashi. The development there so far and this particular move to now clamp down on the opposition.
Well, there's a Senegalese saying that says it's very easy to steal the village drums, but it's very difficult to go and beat the drums peacefully somewhere. You get the drift? Right?
Yes.
But, if you beat
the conscience is there.
That you've stolen the drums of the village. People figure this out. So Mr. Sall wanted to steal the village drum by extending his term to a third term. And this young man mobilized the urban poor and mobilized the working poor and demanded from Senegal's constitution that Macky Sall does not overthrow the constitution, which is happening in the Central African Republic, where they want to extend for a third term. There's a referendum there. It's
already happened.
Yeah, it's illegal.
They've passed
it's very illegal, but this is the things that at the forefront that we ought to fight. To be quite honest, Mr. Sall has grown the economy between 4 to 6% in Senegal. But he has made the rich richer, and he's made the poor poorer. He has adopted neoliberal, disciplinary neoliberal policies from the World Bank and the IMF, which immediately disenfranchises 80% of the working people, the working poor, the peasants, people who are in agriculture, in all these other areas. And therefore, he was a cause célèbre. He was the spark in which the urban poor decided that they did not have a stake in the Senegalese economy. And these are the meat and potatoes of what's happened with the political economy of Senegal. The second thing is that there are massive fishing expeditions from China and the Asian world and in Europe off the coast of Senegal, and hundreds of thousands of tons of fish, which is the basic staple food in Senegal, being taken out of the waters of the people of Senegal and West Africa and exported to China and Japan and all these places, which could be the mutual benefit of the people of Senegal. 1/3 of the people of Senegal are the ones who are drowning in the Mediterranean and crossing the borders to Tunisia, where we have a fascist president who recently signed with Italy and the European Union draconian police military action to stop immigrants from crossing to Europe. Number 4, Senegal, as you know, is the land of Sheikh Anta Diop, probably the leading philosopher, Allah yarhamah, the leading philosopher in African political economy and history. And we know that the people of Senegal have a rich history, but the leadership that is there in Senegal today is causing conflict when there should be cooperation. as to how to make sure that the economy of Senegal gives everybody a fair shake, and Senegal leads the people in integrating West Africa, including the countries of the Sahel, where most of the ethnic groups in Senegal are in the Sahel.
Right. Dr. Hassan Kanenje.
Senegal has been one of the perhaps the most stable, progressive, countries in West Africa for a very long time right now. It has registered a history of peaceful transition in a democratic environment for much of the last few decades. But increasingly, the hustlers there are seeing the current status quo represented by Macky Sall as representing the boardroom and not the street.
Very true.
And so Sonko is now not the Sonko, our Sonko. The Sonko of Senegal has come with a very nationalist, populist kind of rhetoric that speaks to the heart of the hustlers.
Yeah.
That speaks to the core of how actually a lot of Senegalese are feeling, because they don't feel they're part of this new equation of economic progress or stability. Now, I just want to read one statement he made. I'm going to realize, number one, how eloquent he actually is in terms of being able to pass his message. And here he says on Monday, on his Facebook page, if the Senegalese people, for whom I have always fought, abdicate and decide to leave me in the hands of Macky Sall's regime, I will submit, as always, to the divine will. He has a very powerful way of actually playing with words, and that is one of the reasons has endeared him a lot to the street. And Macky Sall needs to be very careful in the way he handles this, because she's extremely, extremely popular. And I dare say, if he were to go into an election with him, do not be surprised that Sonko will win that presidency. And I can predict here, this young man is probably going to become president one of these days, before our very own eyes. But to the extent that Macky Sall has now banned his political party, I don't think that is extremely prudent. It's reactionary, because that is not the character of Senegal, just as much as it's not the character of Kenya right now to start banning political parties. We started because it sets the country onto a wrong trajectory that I don't think any of us, of course, are going to be happy about.
Because I was wondering, where do we get that particular, or from what particular structure of a constitution is it? Is this also what maybe the memorandum by the president he was forwarding, that we should be having an official opposition in government? This is what is happening in Senegal, that you have, it's not really an official opposition, I don't know, but you can actually educate me on this, that now we can have the behest, or the parties which are now on the behest of the president to ban a party. Where does he get that load right?
Now, let's put this in the broader context of what is happening on the continent, and therefore you locate Senegal within it. I think that the big concept is what has been called a democratic recession. We are facing a democratic recession. Democracy is on the decline completely in Africa, and it's surprising for me that it's coming from Senegal, because for many years Senegal has been the symbol of not only stability but accommodating governance. Our own people, majority, went to Senegal as exiles. If you didn't want to go to the West, or you didn't want to go to Europe, or America, where the place you went to was Senegal. Senegal was the first country I flew to myself as a student, as a young scholar, because all the big minds from the African continent had congregated in Dakar and formed this Codestria and many other academic bodies, the Samila Means of this world, Mahmoud Mamdani, the Marawian Tandikam Kandawile, and others who are all
V.Y. Mudimbe.
Yes, V.Y. Mudimbe from Congo. Everybody was there. Because most people did not want to go to Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, because of the socialist orientation, and Senegal provided a very good ambience.
Professor Nyang Nyongo.
Peter, the first time Peter Nyang Nyongo, Professor Nyang Nyongo taught me It was not the University of Nairobi.
in Senegal.
It was in Senegal.
Before you went to Mexico.
Yes, and he taught me not once, not twice.
Yeah.
Of course, the Senegalese don't have a very good name for us because the Kenyans who are normally invited there would be Peter Kagwanja, Peter Nyang'nyongo, and Peter Wanyande. And they wondered whether Peter is the only name.
It's a surname here in the country.
It's a surname in Kenya. But let me say that Senegal basically symbolized the best of us. Hashi has rightly pointed to the philosophical foundations of this country was set by Senegal. The whole notion of African personality was set as a goal. And he was the poet of the 20th century, among the best we had in the world. And at the same time, he set a country on the foundation of good governance when nobody was doing that. And therefore, it's a sad thing that we are now going back. Remember, Senegal has also been at the heart of the reconstruction of the continent. Abdou Wade was one of the 5 pillars of NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development. And on the shores of Senegal, facing the Atlantic, is the Millennium Monument, the best that symbolizes the Africa of the 21st century and the hope of an African rising or African renaissance. Yet it was Wade who started the first drop of rain by basically seeking to get a 3rd term. And in the process of being denied that by Senegal, Macky Sall rose on the wings of that, or the crest of that wave,
the same thing.
of basically sticking to 2 terms. So it's ironical that Macky Sall, who went to power riding on the crest of anti-third termism,
is the one who
in Senegal, is now not only want to impose a 3rd term, but is basically crusading against his opponent rather than tolerating his opponent. And this character of banning parties, jailing opposition, and intimidating the populace is beginning to gain ground in many parts of Africa. You can now begin to say, controversially, that you can count the democratic countries in Africa in your fingertip. If you go to Ethiopia, go to Sudan, go to South Sudan, go to where we are facing this democratic retreat, a very, very serious recession in our times. And I think African population needs to stand up. And I like the statement that Dr. Hanenje read here, because it summarizes what essentially is. Yes, it is charismatic. He's a very his sense of oratory is very high. But ultimately, it is a population that will have to stand up to defend the democratic space. Whether it's here in Kenya, or it is in Tanzania, or it is South Africa, we will have to stand up as civilians and intellectuals and defend our space. It is not the Sonkos. Sonko is a good symbol of what needs to be done by a leader. But ultimately, it is the citizens who will decide the fate. Right.
I would like us just to maybe extrapolate what is happening in Senegal and bring it to the scenario here, because this is where we are at, even with the Public Order Act that is being amended, that you have to be responsible for the demonstrations and the chaos around it. This is exactly a poster child that we can see with Sonko happening in Senegal. Now your party is being burned, you're taken to the slummers, in the street, because you are the picture child of all those demonstrations, or what Senegal is not what it should be. I just want to hear from a brigadier here. So where is it, when you're talking about the recession of democracy, where does it begin? Does it begin from the legislation bit of it? Because we're asking the question, how do you ban the opposition? Was the opposition part also and structure of government, as we're trying to proffer here in the discussions as well, that we should have an official opposition office? So was it also happening in Senegal, where the president will wake up one day and say, now that particular office is banned?
Well, it's unfortunate that Dakar...
Can I reserve that? I give it to...
Okay, good.
Because he's about to leave, so I want to just maximize and mine a lot of his wealth from knowledge of what is happening in Senegal, because as we are still here, he's living.
The Balkama is very unforgiving. and history is replete with contradictions. And if we don't pay attention to it, we are bound, to repeat it. When it comes to protecting and entrenching democracy, we should avoid the temptation of changing the goalpost just because our players are not scoring. Because in the next match, those rules are going to be used against us. And so, no matter how disagreeable you are with your opponent, I think the temptation across the continent should not be to change the goalposts, but to find a way of mediating those differences in a way that can still protect the nascent democracy. It is true, I agree with Prof, democracy is on the decline. That project, I think, for much of the last 30 years, doesn't seem to have offered sufficient hope for the citizen on the street to start believing in the miracle of democracy. And so how are we going to ensure that actually democracy delivers what it promises? Because if we don't, what we are going to see and what you're already seeing is the rise and emergency of authoritarian populism. It's not exactly a best alternative to democracy, because at the end of the day, that's the best there is.
That's the best there is. But democracy is a mirage. Let me come back to Brigadier.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that Dakar is on the verge of burning. A very good, a strong country in Africa. For us in the military, of course, in the UN, we do associate very well with Senegal, in that the first African UN military advisor in New York was from Senegal. The one serving today is from Senegal. The military is very professional and does very well in peacekeeping and all that. So unfortunate that this is actually what is happening. That's what is going on. First, unfortunate that the sitting president was going to seek a third term, and therefore the crisis started from there. And of course, Sonko became a very big challenge to that order. Now, as mentioned earlier, Sonko has become very popular, and in fact, he's able to drive the youth now to what he desires. And his statement as put forward was actually very calling for the youth, that you can't live to fight this together. My point will be that, again, the element of dialogue. That the president should have sought dialogue in finding a way around this, not really rushing to move the opposition. That's not the way to go. And that will only actually create more chaos and give the opposition more strength to fight their case. To me, whether delayed or not, the answer still lies in dialogue in both parties.
Well, I think there's a very important issue that has been brought up by both my colleagues, and I think that this is very pertinent when it comes to the political economy of our continent. There are three questions we need to ask. Does democracy produce jobs? It's number one. Does democracy produce law and order? That's number two. Does democracy produce good government? I think I am firmly on the camp of Afro-optimists. I believe that democratic government is at the very core of our development needs. But Depal, if we live in the context of the international financial system that we're in today, and in the age of globalization, there are certain imperatives that the political class in Africa need to pay attention to. And number one is that the rising groups of our society, and I've said this many times, that constitute 80% of our population are under 30. Their needs, Debal, are massive. Their politics is transformational. The things that they want, Debal, cannot be produced by the type of political leadership we have. And it is very clear to me today that unless we change and transform our economies, broaden our sovereignties, participate in regional citizenship, make linkages with other areas of Africa, Debal, we will experience massive breakdown in law and order, massive breakdown in state systems in this continent. It's already happening in the Sahel. I warned everybody against it. I'm now warning everybody again that if this is going to happen again, all the way down to Malawi. The only two countries I believe that are doing really well. Number one is Botswana. because the political leadership there has figured out how to deal with its resources. It creates diamonds, and today it is polishing them and exporting them. If we don't add value to our coffee, if we don't understand the supply chain, if we don't understand integration, if we don't understand political leadership in the administrative system and in our nation states, we will continue to get these problems coming up. I end by saying this. There is a democratic deficit. Even in Kenya, there's a democratic deficit. Because every 5 years we fight over the election. That means there's a deficit. We don't have a clear leader who is going to govern. Because we don't have the political system in which every citizen can say, oh, I'm confident that this man won. Half the country believes that William Ruto did not win. Half the country believes that he won. Therefore, we have to deal with that. That's why we have these talks. So a complete transformation in political leadership is needed in our continent. And if that doesn't happen, there's going to be a rebellion everywhere.
Thank you. Let's move on to Niger right now before I release Dr. Hassan Kanenja, where West African leaders led by Nigeria have threatened to take military action against the new junta in Niger if it does not restore the democratic government toppled in last week's coup within 7 days. A statement following an emergency meeting of the heads of the 15-member economic community of West African states in Abuja, capital of regional heavyweight Nigeria, said, quote-unquote, in the democracy, I should say, in West Africa. ECOWAS persuaded the then President Yahya Jammeh of Gambia to accept the result of an election or face an invasion by ECOWAS forces. Just briefly on this, Dr. Kanenja, before you move on, and this particular development and the threats, now the military generals also, they're taking their stand.
One of the success stories of African intervention regionally has been ECOMOG, especially in much of the 1980s. But a lot of it had to be attributed to the fact that there was a lot of consensus among the key players, within the region. Right now, there isn't, unfortunately. And in the absence of consensus, especially of neighboring countries, this, if it proceeds, it may turn out to be one of the bloodiest interventions you have seen in recent years. And I don't think that is going to speak very well for the continent. Not to mention, it's not in Niger that we are seeing the first extra-constitutional change in government in West Africa. I think now it completes the circle in the Sahel of those kind of coups. Then why haven't we intervened elsewhere? Why Niger? And that's the question, because even within Nigeria itself, which is pretty much the father of ECOMOG, there are voices within the Senate and within Parliament are actually against that type of intervention. Now, should we keep encouraging the extra-constitutional change in government? No, we shouldn't. One of the irony, though, is the current president, Bazoum, he's the first one in many years to actually be handed over power from another democratically elected president. But there is a lot of discussion that, well, the outgoing president found him, manipulated that election to actually suit the current president, who got about 55% of the vote. And there were lots of citizens and communities, especially since he comes from a minority Arab community, that perhaps he was not as acceptable as what the result, portrayed. And so it is important also to understand the local dynamics in there and to see the extent to which, for instance, the current leader is actually in touch with the people. That does not justify what has happened, but I think it will be reckless to intervene without actually paying attention to what is happening both internally as well as regionally.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kanenja. Let's hear from Dr. Peter Kagwanja, Professor Peter Kagwanja.
I was shocked when a colleague of mine, the University of Illinois, at Urbana-Champaign, where I went to do my doctorate, put a proposal about the whites, and it's a very strong issue. Now, Niger, as we said earlier, symbolizes the what we call the resource curse in Africa, where what is supposed to be curing you is the one that kills you. You are supposed to become a prosperous nation by virtue of having uranium now, particularly in the 21st century, when we are talking about energy and energy storage technologies. So in a sense, that's the way I see it. Now, let's put this again in a broader context, as you asked. Now, we are seeing the rise of authoritarian populists. We are seeing about these authoritarian populists come in many guises. Some come as messiahs. They are coming literally to save their countries from I don't know what. And therefore they are encroaching on the democratic space. And that's what we find in Niger. That's what we found in Senegal. That the democratic space is getting,
stifled.
At the same time, democracy itself is beginning to produce war formations. Rather than teams competing for power, we find competitors being transformed into war formations. And that is what we have seen here in Kenya. The Azimio and Kenya Kwanza are no longer competitors in the spirit of democracy. They are kind of war formations about who will win and who will not win. Or then let's negotiate and move on in that regard. And the question that is being asked is whether, is it democracy we want as an ideology? And I remember it is Henry Kissinger who was saying that the problem with America's presence in Vietnam was that they followed the principles rather than their interests. What is our interest in Africa? Our interest in Africa is stability of democracy, of societies. Let's face it. You don't stabilize democracies on hustlers.
But
that's what they said about us.
You've got to begin from the hustler.
No,
gravitate to the middle class.
No. Unless you are taking us to different universities, you have to start your own university and your own doctrine. Let's face it. The stabilizing force in a country is a middle class.
Yep. But yes, what I was asking is, there's an upward mobility even to the middle class. Where do you begin?
But you
cannot just begin as a middle class.
The hustler is a person with hope that tomorrow I'll be a middle class, and that the next day my son will be the president in this land.
Which belies what you say. You cannot begin.
That's the hope Ruto gives us, that you can come from below to rise to the top, but the society must enable you to do that. So what we are saying is that when we don't focus on issues of development, and when countries become impoverished, as we are doing, our economies are going down and down. That's when you start finding Senegal having a problem of stability. And democracy does not necessarily lead to development. I'm not saying there's an alternative to democracy. That is what Winston Churchill told us, that it is the worst system of government, but there's no better, another one which is better than it.
Thank you.
So, we are facing a democratic deficit, and this democratic deficit is undermining development. So we are in a vicious cycle, and we have to deal with it.
Thank you. Right, let's hear from Brigadier General. When you hear that these other generals now, they're making such a statement against ECOWAS, what really comes to mind?
Well, the bar, of course, an issue of concern. An issue of concern because what we are seeing is what has never happened before in terms of those statements. We know very well that the AU is very clear in terms of military coups. And ECOWAS has stood out and said no more coups in West Africa. And now the challenge is the action they are proposing to take in terms of moving in. I want to mention that all previous interventions in West Africa, African countries, have been a different context. In Liberia, it was a civilian government against an opposition, which was easy to manage, both in terms of political and military action. In Sierra Leone, again, it was action between an existing government and an opposition that was very armed to the teeth to bring change. In Gambia, it was even more different. The situation where a president had won. The sitting president said, no, I'm going nowhere. In that case, you can intervene, But in this case now, where you're saying that there's a coup, and you want to come in, sets a different precedence. Now, it's even more worrying, when the population is not revolting. Population is quiet. How do you come in from outside and intervene with the population? In essence, you're supporting it. It can't work.
It can't work.
It can't work. It becomes even more complicated. The two generals have said, no way. Move in, we'll take a different stand. I think ECOWAS is in a crisis.
So they're saying if you make this move, this is a declaration of war.
Exactly. Yes. They've said that. That's very clear. They've said that very clearly. It's war and they'll take their own actions.
The problem with West Africa is the French Republic. The French need to leave West Africa. This is just a fact.
Right.
We need to say it loud and we need to say it very clearly. The French tried something called mission civilisatrice. This was to create Africans who were Frenchmen. The caricature here is the Humphrey Bonnier of the Ivory Coast. To create these mimic men who tried to be French in the very heart of the world of Mansa Musa and Abu Bakr II. I mean, this is just something that needs to be toppled. This idea needs to be thrown out. We need to let those states either rise through their strengths or fail through their failures. If you keep propping up a failure for the rest of your life, all you're doing is giving a drug addict more drugs. I think it is very important. There are three things that we need to do in West Africa. The first thing we need to do is to ask the people what kind of government they want.
Yeah.
We have to listen to the people. The great and late Julius Nyerere told the Chama cha Mapinduzi before he retired, if you want to govern this country, you have to listen to the people. The people of West Africa are saying no more French. They don't want it, so the French have to leave. The French, have terrorized West Africa for 100 years. But also, I am not an Afro-pessimist. As I've told you, I'm an optimist. But the succeeding leadership today of the French in West Africa, all you have to do is look at Al Jazeera, which is running a documentary on West Africa, on what the French influence has been in West Africa. It has been a scandal but wrapped up in a tragedy. And I think that it is very clear to me that the ECOWAS needs to stop being called by the Americans. When the ECOWAS was meeting, all the American, French, and European delegates were sitting to watch if they were going to say that they were going to intervene. The north of Niger, there's a problem of terrorism. It has got the largest French and it's got the largest American base in Africa that keeps an eye drones. That's where they have the drones. So the political economy of West Africa, which has got the largest wealth in our continent, the largest wealth is in the Great Lakes and in the west of Africa. What needs there has to be a new leadership. There was a new leadership under Thomas Sankara, and it is Francois Mitterrand and his government that assassinated that man. All the leaders who have been in West Africa, who have risen for the people, including in the Great Lakes, have been physically assassinated by the French state.
Right.
And that needs to come out.
Thank you. So lastly, before we go to Russia briefly, because also time is not really on our side, how is NATO-Russia also influence playing out in Niger and even maybe in Senegal, so to speak? Because he has been largely on France, but could we broadly look at the Russia-NATO influence?
France is the representative of NATO.
That is the whole essence. I know he's zeroing in on France because the countries affected. Remember Kenya is Anglophone. So we are technically supposed to be under Europe in this conceptualization of the group. But it is the French part of the world that has a problem. And also that the French have used to the extreme the idea of what is calling mission civilisatrice, which is basically the civilizing mission of the French military. And therefore they have put the military in each of these countries. Now as we speak, there is a French military in Niger and the Chinese. This is what they're saying. And we're back to Samuel Huntington's crash of civilization. Now, we never believed in it. We don't believe in it. It doesn't work. We talk about dialogue of civilization is what works. But Europe is, the NATO is pursuing a kind of a crash of civilization. So it's us versus them. And them means the non-Westerners and the Westerners. And in this case, Niger, Chad, Sudan, as it is now, Burkina Faso, Mali are all new theaters of this crash between NATO and the rest.
I predicted that on this table.
And it is happening.
It is happening.
So that's the context.
Right, thank you. I think you've belabored enough on that. Let's just move on to what is happening with the Ukrainian war. But we've booked tales on what really happened with the Russia-African summit, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has rejected the plea of President Cyril Ramaphosa and other African leaders to restore the Black Sea Grain Initiative The deal under which Russia lifted its blockade of Ukraine's Black Sea ports to enable Ukrainian grain to be shipped to world markets. Ramaphosa surprised some of his critics at the Russia-Africa summit on Friday by telling Putin that the Africans had not come to St. Petersburg to seek food donations, but to ask him to reinstate the grain deal, which he pulled out on 17th July. Putin's response was tantamount to a dismissal of the appeal from the African leaders. The year-old Black Sea Grain Initiative supplied about 32.8 million tons of Ukrainian grain to the world, easing food prices and food insecurity, including in Africa. Ramaphosa and his team also appeared to get no direct satisfaction in their appeal to Putin for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine peacefully and for the principles of the UN Charter to be respected. Ramaphosa was implicitly referring to the fundamental UN principles of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, which Russia has manifestly violated in invading Ukraine. So we were not seeking food rations. Brigadier.
I think it's very clear, but what we fail to understand also is that Russia is building on its areas of strength and securing that so that you can come back much more and be able to negotiate. You know, that's what they are doing. And not in one area, in so many areas that they are doing this, to include even the argument about Putin and Wagner fighting, you know, which was actually another area that they were just trying to see who is who and be able to put a better stand. So to me, it's an issue of Russia seeking that stability, building on its strength and telling you, we are here, come back to us, let's discuss. And therefore build on that to get more strength.
Interesting, you mentioned also Wagner, because we're discussing Wagner and we had the president of Wagner, Prozotny, really applauding what is happening in Niger. And he's saying, oh, we are ready, we stand at the ready to step into Russia. To step into Niger.
2 points here, that Russia is building a diplomatic axis. And
who was receiving the delegates as well? Did you see?
Yes.
You can comment on that.
Well, you know, the diplomatic axis that Russia is building. And it's and I argued on this show that we in Africa have a responsibility because of the history of the Soviet Union in the liberation struggle in Africa. We had a responsibility to go and listen to Russia's view and to understand that the NATO and what it was doing in Ukraine in the last 20 years and in the former Soviet Union was something that was creating flux in international situations. But Africa has got the most fertile and the largest agricultural space on earth.
Indeed.
Why are we going to Russia to ask for grain?
Indeed.
This is the incompetency of African leaders, Debal. We are unable, as a young man growing up, Debal, we used to eat something called buffalo. Kawanja remembers buffalo, doesn't he? And you know, every town had a bakery. And Debal, there was wheat farms in Narok. There was wheat farms everywhere. We were self-sustaining in grain in this country until Daniel Toroitich, may he rest in peace, came around, and there was a complete mismanagement of this country, and this country went to the dogs, and we couldn't make that buffalo. Debal, we used to get milk in the neighborhood. There was a Kenya Creameries Association, which brought amazing milk to your neighborhood in bottles. That was destroyed too.
The butter was amazing.
The butter was amazing. We were moving towards self-sufficiency in this country. And it was Mwai Kibaki who was the Minister of Finance, a brilliant man. Brilliant man. I'm very sorry I fought against him. I took a goat to his house after I went and apologized. He said, I'm very sorry. And he told me, you know, Mohammed's son, he knows my father. He said, it's okay. Now, the third thing is, we have to put the political economy of Africa first and foremost. Isaias Afwerki was there. The one from Central Africa were there. They had their hand with a thing saying we need grain. They were not talking about the issues of international relations and multilateralism and the UN and how to reform the international global system. And they went there with 20 presidents. Why could they not send the chairman of the African Union by himself? We don't need presidents trooping over to see Russia and Africa. Africa is 100 times bigger than Russia. There's more history than Russia. Well, I think that it is high time that the leadership of our countries, and these some of them shouldn't be countries developed. We need regionalism. We need agricultural policies that produces jobs and food for our people, so that we don't rush to the Baltic to go and ask for grain. We need leadership in this continent, and it must be produced, not because on anything else, because the demands of the people are now growing and tremendous.
Right. I was just referring to what Okonjo Ngozi, the director of World Trade Organization, she was commenting, especially when you're looking at Africa, even as we're winding up. She's saying there is no reason why we import 100 metric tons of food.
Great.
That's what Africa imports annually.
Can you imagine?
Valued at about 75 billion shillings, dollars, according to the African Development Bank. And why are we spending all that money when we can produce our own food?
Yes.
Africa produces around 30 million tons of fertilizer a year, but most of that is exported. And then the continent imports 90% of the fertilizer it uses. It really doesn't make any sense.
It's ridiculous.
We are really talking about I spoke about political entrepreneurship, basically manipulation of the system in order to enrich individuals. This is beyond what you call chronic capitalism. This is basically a warped form of governance. And why we don't grow food is because it's profitable to our elite to import food.
Right.
Maize.
It is profitable
Corruption.
for Kenyans, for the Kenyan elite, to import maize from wherever,
or
even to grow it.
Yes.
I mean, gossip have it that
Correct.
they're growing it in Congo so that you import it,
here.
back to Kenya. You are a Kenyan growing maize elsewhere so that you export it back to Kenya. I know one of the main export. I mean, I was in Changsha in China and found that the person who is exporting Ugandan coffee and so on to is a Kenyan from somewhere from my county of Murang'a, and you can tell that the Kenyans prefer, not Kenyans alone, Africans prefer to import things. We prefer to import rice from Pakistan and India rather than expanding where to bury another rice. I mean, you don't want to grow a lot of rice in Kisumu because you're going to empower Raila and so on. And that is one of our main sources of rice, because we have a lot of land. So that's the point. It's not that we don't have land, we don't have water.
Let's wind up on that.
Yes.
Let's wind up. I know we can discuss about that. Let's just get the last comments. We begin with Brigadier.
Okay.
Your closing remarks.
Well, Diba, I want to say that there seems to be actually crisis in Africa, what we have seen across the entire continent.
Yep.
You know, building from Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, DRC, and they're going to the West now. And definitely we need as Kenyans to make sure that our house is in order. And I strongly believe that we need to go back on the drawing board, look at issues that affect us as individuals, as politicians, as a nation, and find best strategies to address these issues in order to build a strong and stable Kenya.
Right.
I want to call on our foreign minister to summon the liaison of the Hargeisa administration, who has been doing extrajudicial killing in Las Anod, where he's been pummeling them with artillery. And now, 100 kilometers away from Hargeisa, there are young men who have climbed a mountain there, or a hill, to oppose his administration. We want to know whether Kenyans are safe in Hargeisa. We need to know that. And that liaison officer needs to come to the Foreign Office to explain what is going on there, because we need to pay close attention to northern Somalia. There is something very wrong being done there by Colonel Musa Bihi, and we must stop it.
All right. Professor Peter Kagonja, finally.
I want to applaud our president for taking the advice of other Kenyans seriously, that he is the ultimate source of our protection of our wealth and property, and he is also the convener of Kenya Talking, and he has just done that by allowing Kenyans to talk. I hope what we move to next is where we don't talk about ourselves, we talk about our country.
Yes.
We need to talk about Kenyan issues, not about our privileges and positions.
Indeed. Thank you. A good point to wind up. We'll pick up on that, of course, next week, just following on this development. On your screen, you have military history. If you want to hack back into history and understand, you can know this man as well. This is Churchill's tanks, and that is a face of Churchill in his younger days. I normally see his old face, but now he was looking younger there. The wild one, that WW1 Lord of the Admiralty, championed armored landships. I think those makes sense to Brigadier General. That is the latest. I was fighting for caves in Afghanistan, and also the Asian lands on no one needed. Calling attention on the Hello Girls, that's the military history. Also, we have the new copy of the Newsweek, Jesus Takes Hollywood. Right, Sound of Freedom is the latest mega hit in a surge of faith-based movies and TV shows. This is what we have there. If you may just put it in full. And then finally,